This podcast is sponsored by Propertymark, the professional body and regulator for estate and letting agents, commercial property agents and auctioneers. Search Propertymark Protection to find an expert who understands your local property market. Here we are again, joined by Maxine Fothergill from Propertymark. She runs things on the rental side for Propertymark. Propertymark is the industry body that is, well, we love it at Move IQ because you're setting up regulation and making things a lot more kind of transparent and protecting everybody involved in this crazy world of property, whether you're buying, selling or renting. And I want to talk to Maxine today about the options for a tenant at the end of tenancy, because that is something that people worry about. We get asked questions about what happens when, what can I do, and it's a worrying time. You're in your home, it's your home. You've paid rent to the landlord, you've settled your family, your kids are in school, but there is a moment of concern. In fact, there were quite a few moments of concern at the end of tenancy. So, Maxine, thank you again for joining us on the pod. Can we just chat through what happens at the end?
Yes, certainly.
I know most of your members rent their properties out on assured short hold tenancies. What happens at the end of a tenancy, Maxine? Because it's a period of worry for a tenant.
Yes, yeah. Well, that really comes down to the conversation that's been had with the landlord. So, does the landlord want the tenancy to continue? Does the tenant want to continue? The first person that we would always speak to would be our landlords. And then when we know the wishes of the landlords, then we will then liaise with the tenant. So we will contact the tenant, we'll find out if the tenant wishes to continue, and then we will take it from there.
Okay. In previous podcasts, we and I've talked to some of your colleagues as well about moving out and the challenges of that and inventories and that kind of thing. But presuming that a landlord wishes to carry on renting the property and a tenant is happy to carry on living there, what happens to the rent?
Well, the rents can obviously everything depends on what's within your tenancy agreement. So if our agents will be using our model a la Propertymark tenancy agreement, and in any good tenancy agreement, then it will always allow for rental increases, but it will only be annually. You cannot increase the rent by law more than once a year, and generally it's normally within cost of living. So at the end of, if it's been a 12-month period and the tenancy will continue, then probably there's going to be a small cost of living with actually, within the new tenancy agreement.
Can you just tell us what you mean by cost of living?
At the moment, it's around 3% that rates are actually increasing. So just whatever the cost of living rates are at that time.
And is that the general cost of living and going out and buying your pint of milk and your loaf of bread? Or is it related to the conditions of the rental market? Because that could go down.
It's established by the landlord, who's actually then been liaising with us as the agents. So we will ask the landlords, we will tell them what the going rate is, or within the tenancy agreement. We can't generally, if the tenancy agreement's in place, it's what's actually stated within the tenancy agreement.
So that might say at the end of the term, the rents will increase by no more than 3% or something.
It normally says APR or cost of living on a tenancy agreement. So
that is a fact. That is, anybody, tenant and landlord, can go and look at the cost of living, the APR. Go, okay, well that's what it's going to be.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So that should be nice and clear. And if people want to renew and notice, or indeed want to leave, can you just talk a bit about notice periods and what's required, what's expected?
Yes, certainly. If a landlord wants to regain possession of the property, then a landlord has to give a minimum 2 months notice period. And that is generally a bit more than that.
Yeah.
So because then there's also notice of service time. So I would always say at least 2 months and at least another couple of weeks, because it all depends when the tenancy agreement started to whether the tenancy is going to end. So if the landlord
that notice may come in. So say the tenancy term naturally was to expire in February.
Yes.
And the landlord wanted to regain possession, they would need to give notice in December.
Yes, they would. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's no good being one day over. So it all depends on what date it is.
Right.
So that 2 months notice period, I always say allow at least another couple of weeks on top of those 2 weeks, because otherwise the notice might be invalid if a tenant is actually served with a Section 21 notice.
So as a tenant, and I'm thinking from their perspective, if you get into the last 2 months or the last month of a tenancy, of a natural tenancy term, then you won't be being kicked out. You will get to extend because the landlord hasn't given notice.
No, this is why it's really important to have good, clear communication, because that's the last thing you want. And there certainly has been circumstances of that where there's been no communication. I would hope that it's not been one of our agents, but I've certainly heard of it in the past where there's been no communication and the tenant has suddenly dropped their keys through the landlord's door at midnight, the day the tenancy ends. So for us, it's really important when this is something that we do within our training, and when we support our agents, is that communication is vital. It really is important.
But it goes both ways, doesn't it? It really does. So both tenant and landlord have responsibilities under the terms of the tenancy of the lease, and it's therefore vital that both understand one another's rights and responsibilities and obligations. So if the tenant is going to leave at the end of the natural term, how much notice would they need to give?
A tenant would only need to give 1 month's clear notice. And a landlord needs to give 2 months clear notice. But you don't want it to be at that stage. You need to be speaking to your tenants well and truly beforehand and seeing if they wish to continue. I mean, in some cases, what we find with some of our tenants is that they don't particularly want to start another fixed term, because they don't know their circumstances. They might be changing jobs, or they're not too sure what's going to be happening, and in which case what we would do is communicate with the landlord, and we'd probably put that tenancy onto a periodic rather than a new fixed term.
Can you just talk us through that periodic term?
Yes. At the end of a tenancy agreement, if it's then just continue to roll on, then it will be rolling on a month-to-month basis. But it doesn't mean to say that changes with the notice period, because a landlord still has to give a minimum of 2 months notice, and a tenant still has to give a minimum of 1 month's notice. But it just means that there's no fixed term in place. It just continues to roll on.
And in a situation where there has been no communication and it has reached the end of its natural term, but the tenant remains and the landlord remains happy with the situation, does it just naturally roll on? If no one says anything, no one writes to each other or rings anyone, but carries on paying the right rent, etc., does it just naturally roll on month by month?
Generally, yes. If they're both happy, it's not a good idea not to have any communication.
No.
For varying different reasons. But if that is the case and it's just sort of like reached its natural end and the tenant continues to pay and the landlord continues to receive the rent, then it would then automatically have gone into a periodic tenancy.
And there must be loads of those around the country where people have been renting a house or a flat for a long time and they just carry on paying and the landlord carries on receiving, and they don't actually know where things are at. They do. They still have protection, though, don't they?
Yes. Yeah. They do. They have the same rights and protections all the way through. They have the right to quiet enjoyment. Everything remains the same as what it was in a fixed term. So the tenants are well and truly protected through the Landlord and Tenant Act.
Okay. Maxine, we've covered loads of this in different podcasts through this series, but could you just talk a little bit about what happens when it goes wrong? How do Propertymark agents get involved, and how do they help sort things out, reach solutions when there's mediation needed, when there's some dispute at the end?
Okay. Well, if things start to go drastically wrong, the one good thing with us is that we are agents, so it's and we're pretty good generally as agents, as being really good mediators, because we're not the landlord and we're not the tenant. And so what we try to always do is to try and reach amicable situation between both parties. And that's the great thing about using a Propertymark agent, because we are good at doing what we do.
Yes.
And we're certainly able to, in many cases, mediate, sort out problems, get problems resolved. If a tenant is having financial difficulty or there's something going on in their lives, we're really good at being able to sit down and listen to the tenant, and then relay that conversation back to our landlords to try and reach, sort of an amicable kind of agreement between both sides.
But of course, you are the landlord's agent, aren't you? You're not the tenant's agent. You are representing the interests of the landlord. So I think people just need to take that into account. But what I love about what you all stand for at Propertymark is that you have taken responsibility. The owners, as people have stepped forward and said, well, I'm going to be a Propertymark agent. I'm going to follow the rules. I'm going to be under regulation. I'm going to get qualified. I'm going to do my continual professional development. And that gives a good feeling of comfort to people involved in these. They can be really stressful situations, but landlords have debts, they have mortgages, they use the rent to pay the mortgage. If you don't pay the rent, they don't pay the mortgage, all hell breaks loose. Equally, as a tenant, it's your home, it's your environment, it's your privacy, it's your sanctuary. And you've got a right to be there. So, Maxine, I'm ever so grateful. It's a really delicate, interesting topic, but it keeps us all in work, and we should be grateful for that.
I mean, for one thing, I will say is that for us as an organisation at Propertymark, we are really proud of what we do. We've got over 18,000 members that are very proud to actually display the Propertymark logo.
I'm wearing it.
You are, so am I.
Yeah.
But we are, and I do actively encourage people. It's the one thing that you haven't actually spoken to me about is why use a Propertymark agent, and I would say why not. To do things yourself, and I do come across quite a few landlords that come to us because they've had a bad experience. They've had a bad experience because they might well have placed adverts in the local paper. They've tried to do it all themselves. They've tried to actually cut costs because they've seen, an agent, you're obviously paying for an agent. But what they've not realised is actually paying for an agent is fully tax deductible. So every single penny that a landlord actually pays to a professional agent is 100% tax deductible. So why do it yourself? We've got over 160 parts of legislation that's in place, and a landlord needs to know that, and they need to know everything. And if they don't, and then they got caught, falling down the trap somewhere along the way because they haven't done something right, then they could get themselves in a heck of a lot of trouble. It's
difficult though, isn't it? I hear what you're saying, and I endorse it. And I use an agent, a Propertymark agent, on properties that I let out. However, the business of buy to let is tougher, is tighter, and the margins are pretty small nowadays. So if you are trying to cut costs and you're looking at the agent and think, well, that's quite a large chunk of a already tight business model, that's all well and good until things go wrong. And when they go wrong and you haven't got representation or support in the form of an agent, then they go really wrong. And that's just a minefield. Anyway, Maxine, great to talk to you. Thanks. Keep doing what you're doing. It's brilliant.
Thank you. Lovely talking to you as well. Thank you, Phil.
Great advice. Thank you.